I'm Greg Jarrett.
I'm Sandra Smith.
I'm Charles Payne, and this is the Fox News Rundown.
Wednesday, July 1st, 2020. I'm Dave Anthony. It's almost 4 months till Election Day. And despite the corona crisis and racial unrest, former House Speaker Newt Gingrich is still confident about a Trump re-election.
This is the most disruptive president since Andrew Jackson. He terrifies the left.
I'm Chris Foster. It's right there in the Constitution. Every 10 years, Americans are asked to come forward to be counted. And this year,
we want people to understand that responding to the census has never been more important, given where we are and how things have transpired over the past couple of months.
And I'm Robert Jeffress. I've got the final word on the Fox News Rundown.
It's summer, and the presidential campaign is heating up. 18 weeks before Election Day, Joe Biden came out swinging.
The president gives no direction, and he pits us against one another. We can't continue like this.
Calling the Trump coronavirus response a failure.
And it seems like our wartime president has surrendered, waved the white flag, and left the battlefield.
And the presumed Democratic nominee reacted to the new Russia controversy. Intel reports that Moscow tried to pay the Taliban to kill U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan. The president says he never got that intelligence. It was deemed not credible. Biden says if he was briefed and did nothing,
the public should, unrelated to my running, conclude that this man isn't fit to be president of the United States of America.
Now, the president often calls Biden Sleepy Joe, saying there's something wrong with him.
Watch me, and I can hardly wait to compare my cognitive capability to the cognitive capability of the man I'm running against.
The former vice president committed to 3 debates this fall. And Newt Gingrich expects it will be a tough fight for President Trump.
I think he will get reelected, but I think it's a real serious knockdown, drag-out situation. It's not automatic, and it's not easy.
The former House Speaker has a new book out, Trump and the American Future. And he also has a new special on Fox Nation, Crisis 2020.
I think you have to be concerned when you go through the Chinese virus, the government-imposed depression, people under lockdown unhappily, and then the tragic killing of George Floyd and the demonstrations leading to riots and looting. There's a lot of things going on. When I first wrote my new book, Trump and the American Future, I finished it at the end of February when things were amazingly good. Lowest black unemployment rate in history, lowest Hispanic unemployment rate in history. Everything seemed to be working. And then, boom, the Chinese virus showed up, everything fell apart, and I had to go back and rewrite parts of the book. It would have looked goofy. So,
yeah, well, it's actually interesting when you read it, because as I write this in March, as the coronavirus takes hold, it added an extra element of uncertainty that you didn't expect, obviously.
We're going to have to learn to manage the virus, because you can't close down, the largest economy in the world for 3 years, or whatever length of time the public health people would figure out. So you're going to have to learn how to manage it. And in fact, if you read beneath the newspaper headlines, things are getting substantially better.
Obviously, it's not easy for any president to be reelected with a bad economy. George H.W. Bush found that out in 1992. If the economy doesn't recover as quickly in a V shape as a lot of the president's advisors are saying it will that be a real problem for him October and then early November?
Sure. I mean, but people don't have to see it having fully recovered, but they have to see a trend line that indicates it will recover. And I think frankly, there's a pretty good chance that's going to happen. I think what you have right now, I just noticed that the consumer confidence came in substantially higher than people expected. And I think we're seeing housing sales go up much faster than people expected. So I think you may see a lot of pent-up energy and pent-up drive. I personally think that they ought to pass a one-year holiday on the payroll tax, and they ought to pass 100% expensing so businesses could modernize and bring all their manufacturing back from China. I would like to see that done just as an insurance policy to accelerate the rate of growth. But I think if people think that we're coming back, then they're going to say Trump is much better at this than Biden. If it looks like we're not coming back, then I think Trump has a different problem.
This is another big issue. Weeks of protests, flag burning, tearing down monuments and statues calling for racial justice. An effort to reform policing stalled, though, at the Senate.
Our effort was a sincere effort, authentic effort, based on true discussions with African-American leaders and law enforcement.
Republican Senator Tim Scott urged Democrats to compromise, but after they passed their own bill in the House, Speaker Nancy Pelosi said,
"This whole thing of equivalence, why can't you work together? Because they don't share our values on this subject. Not yet. But I hope that they will."
Some communities are taking up the protesters' cause, like New York City, cutting the police budget. Newt Gingrich is a big no on that.
The country understands that the idea of defunding the police makes no sense at all. When you watch, for example, in New York, the worst mayor in the country, de Blasio, with record number of people being shot last week in New York City, he decides he's going to cut the police budget by $1 billion and not hire 1,300 policemen who were in the pipeline are supposed to get hired. Now, that's just crazy. And I think the average American knows when you look at a week of looting and violence in Minneapolis, and then they decide to cancel the police department, I think the average person thinks that that's just madness. And there's no evidence that the average American thinks defunding the police is a rational strategy.
The president, through this process and before, dating back to what happened with Charlottesville, the president has been called by Democrats who are in Congress a racist or a white supremacist. He's been called a bigot. You write in your book about the language that the president deals with and has to battle in his fight for reelection. I'm assuming that's going to happen and continue to happen.
Well, sure. Look, you have to start with a very simple premise. This is the most disruptive president since Andrew Jackson. He terrifies the left. When he gets 300 judges confirmed, the average left-winger goes crazy. They hate him. Unfortunately, a large part of the propaganda media that used to be news media hates him. And you saw things like the New York Times where they published one column by a conservative senator, and the editor got fired for publishing one column. So I think it's amazing that Trump has been able to stay standing.
There is a big rethinking, though, of the people from founding fathers all the way up until Woodrow Wilson, for instance, being his name taken off of a school at Princeton. There's a big rethinking of those men and that they were either racists or bigots or acknowledging those kinds of things. So where do you stand on that?
I think most of it's crazy. Nobody's perfect. But George Washington was the extraordinary leader of great moral courage on whom the entire nation stands. This was the first country to say that your rights come directly to you from God. And we have spent the last 240 years expanding that only to include everybody. So we are not a perfect country, but we're a country seeking to improve the lives of everyone.
Now the critics say that Washington and Jefferson owned slaves, and they should be condemned for that.
They did. Yeah, but look, it's a little hard. It's hard for me to deal with this rationally because I think they're so stupid. If you go back in history and you decide that you're going to apply this week's standards, all right? At some point in the near future, it will occur to the gay pride movement that we should take down the statues of everybody who favored traditional marriage. And then I'm sure the transgender wing of that movement will decide we should take down everybody who didn't fully appreciate and understand being transgender. And you go down the list. I mean, where does it stop? I was born in Pennsylvania. My relatives fought in the Union Army. I grew up in an integrated U.S. Army. The first bill I sponsored when I went to Congress was Martin Luther King's birthday. So I'm not saying any of this out of indifference or out of lack of concern, but to then jump from that to taking down a Washington statue, I think is historically so destructive and so crazy that it's very hard for me to deal with it rationally.
All right, in your book, You wrote, "There's one thing every Republican needs to understand in 2020. The unending media hostility is not a problem. It is a fact. What we do about it is the problem."
Any serious conservative Republican who doesn't start out every morning knowing that the news media will be totally against you is just making a huge mistake. Think of it, it's the equivalent of having a sailboat and knowing that you're always going to go into a headwind. So you just have to learn how to tack and how to get around it.
The media says it's the president who is playing loose with the facts. They have a counter that talks of thousands of times that he's lied or made misstatements on Twitter and other places. The president, of course, loves to tweet. It does get him in trouble sometimes.
Right. No, I've told him personally, I like about the 10% less Trump would be 100% more effective.
Has he listened to you? Does he listen to you?
No, of course not. He looked at me and said, "Are you talking about my tweets?" I said, "Yes." I said, "I like about 80% of them." He said, No, it's got to be 95. And I said, "I'm not negotiating what percent I like." But it was just classically Trump.
When he gets into the fall and he goes head-to-head with Joe Biden, what do you think his strategy should be?
To talk consistently about the Biden, Schumer, Pelosi machine and how radical they would be if they had power and what they would try to do, and to take up H.R. 6800, which is the $3 trillion Pelosi bill, which has so much radicalism in it that you could spend the whole fall campaign just on that one bill. And I'll just give you one example. 207 Democrats voted for it. It includes a provision to give every single illegal immigrant $1,200 as a stimulus. Now, I don't think there are very many districts in the United States that think we need to give illegal immigrants $1,200. The real danger from a standpoint of most Americans is what having a Democratic Senate, Democratic House, Democratic White House. They would turn the country into some cross between California and Seattle.
The polls have showed Biden in the lead. The president has called the polls a joke.
I was campaigning with George H.W. Bush when he was 19 points behind Dukakis, and he won. So, it just depends.
So you're not worried about any of the polls now?
No, I'm not worried about the polls now. I think the polls tell you the combination of Biden being allowed to hide with the news media, carefully avoiding asking any embarrassing questions, while every morning they figure out every possible way to attack the president. And as you pointed out, you're in the middle of the virus, the government-induced depression, have people having been isolated and to some sense still isolated, and substantial unrest, including looting and violence. And, I think all of that makes it harder for the incumbent to make the case. If it's a referendum on Trump, he might win. He might lose. If it's a choice between Trump and a Biden, Pelosi, Schumer team, I suspect he'll win by a surprising margin.
The book is Trump and the American Future, Solving the Great Problems of Our Time, from former House Speaker Newt Gingrich. Also, the new special on Fox Nation, Crisis 2020. Speaker, thank you very much for joining us again.
Thank you. Glad to do it.
This is Robert Jeffress with your Fox News commentary. Coming up.
It's that time every 10 years when Americans are counted to determine representation in Congress and where a lot of federal money goes, among other things. And there's a push on to encourage people to take part in the census.
Hey, America, I've got something to say.
Completing your 2020 census could mean smoother roads.
Or more emergency rooms. Or more representation in our government.
There's still a lot of counting to do, with workers going door to door, coronavirus or not. A lot of Americans have already taken it upon themselves to participate, many of them online.
Most, if not all, households across the country actually have been invited to respond to the census, and as of today, 61.7%, that's nearly 62% of all households across the country, across our nation, have responded to the 2020 census.
Michael Cook is chief of the Public Information Office at the U.S. Census.
Based on our estimates for self-response, we are ahead of where we were, or where we had planned to be, rather, at this point in the campaign. But we are dogged and laser focused, on ensuring that everybody knows that the census is still being conducted. You still have an opportunity to respond, and that the best response is a self-response, and we'd like people to respond as soon as possible.
Not that you want people to wait, but people do have a little more time now, right? Your deadline's moved?
Our deadline has moved. There are a number of operations that we've adjusted due to the ongoing pandemic, and our self-response period has been extended to October 31st of this year. But mind you, the non-response follow-up, or I should say the door knocking, which people are familiar with when we talk about, census workers coming to the door, that type of follow-up with houses who haven't responded will commence. It will start this summer. And during that period, people can still self-respond. That's the beauty of and the resilience of our campaign this decade, that it's constructed in a way where there is an ability to respond online for the duration of the campaign, but it's our jobs to help let people know the value beyond by responding. You affect your local community when it comes to power and money, political representation at all levels of government, including the House of Representatives and local elected officials, but then also services that come down and are used and utilized by informed decisions based on a complete and accurate count of counting everybody only once and in the right place, so that decision makers can make informed decisions that impact the lives of the people that live in local communities. So it's important for people to respond early, knowing that we have to October 31st to respond, but being a good steward of taxpayers' dollars, I need to encourage everybody to respond and to respond early.
Talk about, you did a little bit, the benefits to someone's community. For anybody who might say, why bother? For example, who stands to win and lose House seats this time around?
Well, part of the process or the outgrowth, the benefits of responding to the census, I alluded to it earlier, is power. And when we talk about power, that's political representation. And for those who aren't steeped in how the government works, there is a count of all of the residents that live in the United States every 10 years, every year that ends in the zero. It's required by the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 2. Those responses are then used to shape decisions of how billions of dollars in federal, state, and local funds are spent in your community for the next 10 years. So it's not about this being an impact that is just for here and now, but it's for 10 years. So a non-response, or I should say an inaccurate count of anybody that lives in your local area will in fact impact or negatively impact the federal funding for local hospitals, schools, emergency services, whether you're talking about rural communities where it's grants for farmers and for block grants and things of that nature, whether it's for students who are receiving Pell Grants. So it touches every single facet of our society and our nation and our neighborhoods, our states, and our communities.
Now comes the hard part, which becomes a little bit harder, if not a lot harder, because of the outbreak. There are going to be people who may be reluctant to have contact. What are you doing to protect workers? What are you doing to make respondents feel safe?
Right now, when you look at the response and the fact that people need to respond and how they respond and who's assisting us with that response, the census is yours. The census is not an operation that we're actually doing and making you do. The census is actually, the power is in your hand. It's in it's your ability to stand up and to respond and to be counted is really where the rubber meets the road. We want people to understand that responding to the census has never been more important, given where we are and how things have transpired over the past couple of months. We are providing training for all of our staff that at one point or at some point may be in your neighborhood. We're ensuring that we're following all of the guidance, all of the local mandates when it comes to protecting not only our staff, but protecting those that they come into contact with, or those neighborhoods that they're actually going across and knocking on doors and coming into contact with. There are PPEs that we've issued to them. There is training that we've provided to them, as well as the communications. That communications to the communities let them know that it's okay to open your doors and it's okay to come into contact with census employees. That's going to be critical.
Michael, for history fans out there, talk about just how long this has been happening. The census is almost as old as the nation.
The census, because it is in the Constitution, that would lead one to think that it is something that is steeped in tradition. 1790 was the very first census that was conducted. And back in 1790, obviously, it wasn't conducted the way it is now. There were U.S. Marshals who traversed across the country to homesteads and to homes and households, and they enumerated households. They observed and took account of what they saw and filled out forms accordingly. The power of the census not only is that I think we have the technology in place to ensure an accurate and complete count, moreover than we had in the past, and we've fine-tuned all of our processes and procedures. But now, in these times, responding to the census is something that the actual residents of the United States do. It's about self-response. It's about you identifying who you are and telling us what race you are, what ethnicity you are. It's not us observing and then filling out a form as if we know exactly what and who you are. So the census, through the decades, it does change. It shows the population, how it shifts, how it grows, those dynamics, and the information that we collect for those genealogists who are very interested with bated breath, waiting for our next census to be released. The 1950 census is going to be released in 2022. We have a rule in place. It's a 72-year rule. So 72 years after we actually collect the data, we don't actually do it. It's National Archives that does it. They actually release that information, records and all, so that genealogists, family members, people that want to look at the history of the United States, that snapshot 72 years prior can take a look and see how their household or how their community responded to the census during that decade.
Well, it's really interesting, the 72-year rule. I have a lot of genealogists, amateur genealogists as family and friends, and they'll be happy to hear about that news in a couple of years. One more thing. You guys also do your best to count the homeless population. How do you do it?
Well, the homeless population and all populations are important for us to count. The homeless population, every decade, there's a couple of nights out of during the cycle where we actually traverse across the country and work closely with local jurisdictions to help identify those locations where the homeless population does reside, where they usually sleep, the tent cities. We work with soup kitchens and other type of facilities that house people who are experiencing homelessness. We do continue to look into and to evaluate on a case-by-case basis, state-by-state basis, community-by-community basis, how we will do that operation. But there are plans for us to conduct that operation this decade, regardless of the ongoing situation with COVID-19.
Not only did you get breathing room as far as responses goes, you have some breathing room in terms of delivery of the data. We're not going to get it at the end of the year. It's going to be probably now April 30th, I guess, the White House will get those numbers. So a little delayed, but as required by the Constitution, there's going to be a 2020 census. Michael Cook, Chief of the Public Information Office at the U.S. Census Bureau. Michael, thanks for coming on the Fox News Rundown.
Thanks for having me. And anybody who wants to know more, please visit 2020census.gov for more information. And if you haven't responded, please respond as soon as you can.
Download and subscribe to original podcast from Fox News Radio.
It's time to get caught up on what's happened and what's next. I'm Jared Halpern from Washington.
Subscribe and listen now by going to foxnewspodcast.com.
Rate and review the Fox News Rundown on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen.
It's time for your Fox News commentary.
Robert Jeffress.
What's on your mind?
This past Sunday, our church, the First Baptist Church in Dallas, hosted our annual Celebrate Freedom worship service. The Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Dr. Ben Carson, was here, as well as Senator John Cornyn and Governor Greg Abbott. But the honored guest who brought the message was our Vice President, Mike Pence. He delivered a refreshing message of hope in the midst of what have been some of our nation's darkest days. The Vice President, the public servant coordinating the federal government's response to the coronavirus, made clear that his hope comes not from his own wisdom or even from the great strength and material prosperity of our country. Instead, his hope comes from the personal faith in the Lord Jesus Christ he found as a teenager on a rainy evening in Kentucky. Vice President Pence heard the good news that God the Father so loved this sin-sick world that he sent his only begotten Son to give us eternal life. I, for one, heartily agree with what the Vice President said about our nation's historic formula for success. The foundation of America is freedom, and the foundation of freedom is faith. America simply would not have come to exist were it not for its strong commitment to freedom. And the freedom our nation has enjoyed for so long would not have continued to exist were it not for its strong commitment to faith. This has been true for our nation's history, and it remains true for our nation's future. So many forces in our country work against faith and seek to undermine it. An aggressive secularism seeks to scrub religion from the public schools, the public square, and from our public servants. That would spell disaster for our nation. As Alexis de Tocqueville observed, America is great because America is good. If America ever ceases to be good, America will cease to be great. And we can only be good when we have a saving encounter with Jesus Christ, when we're healed from our sinful desires by the Holy Spirit, and when we're reconciled to God the Father in heaven. That's the kind of transformation our nation needs, one life at a time.
You've been listening to the Fox News Rundown. Stay up to date by subscribing to this podcast at foxnewspodcasts.com. And for up-to-the-minute news, go to foxnews.com.
Love Fox News? Click the subscribe button to get more of the news and opinion you trust, and click the Fox News Rundown playlist for the latest episodes.